February 21st, 1945. The United States Navy had become an ocean-spanning machine, with carrier groups prowling the Western Pacific, while amphibious convoys crossed thousands of miles with growing confidence. Japan's once feared battle fleet had been shattered, yet in the waters off Iwo Jima, that machine still had vulnerable points. They were called escort carriers. Small compared to fleet carriers, these ships were built on merchant hulls, thin-skinned, and packed with aviation gasoline, bombs, and rockets stacked just below wooden flight decks. Sailors nicknamed them jeep carriers, and sometimes, more grimly, Kaiser coffins. They existed for one reason alone: to keep fighters in the air over invasion fleets, a mission that placed them directly in the path of Japanese planners searching for weak spots. As darkness settled over the volcanic islands, several aircraft lifted off from airfields scattered across southern Japan. Some carried bombs and some carried torpedoes, but all carried pilots who had been told this would be their final flight. By dawn, one American carrier would be gone. Her name was USS Bismarck Sea. The ocean around the invasion area glowed faintly from fires burning ashore, while naval guns boomed inland in slow, distant rhythm. On the water, dozens of ships crept through assigned stations like luminous insects, their wakes ghostly under starlight. Everything depended on that floating shield. Troop transports lay packed with soldiers waiting to go ashore, cargo vessels stacked with ammunition and fuel, and hospital ships hovering farther back in darkness. Above them all, fighter patrols orbited in wide circles, burning precious fuel while radar operators below spoke bearings into telephones. Since the landings on Iwo Jima 3 days earlier, alarms had become more reliable than meals. Japan could no longer challenge the Americans in daylight with surface fleets. Their carriers were gone, and their veteran pilots were dead or scattered. But one weapon remained, terrifying in its simplicity: special attack operations, mass suicide strikes designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers and persistence, sending wave after wave of aircraft toward the invasion fleet. Hundreds of aircraft lifted off in staggered waves from Kyushu and nearby islands, slipping through weather fronts, darkness, and radar gaps before descending toward the American fleet in concentrated storms. The escort carriers lay directly in that path, stationed between attackers and the crowded transports they were meant to protect. USS Bismarck Sea, Hull number 95, belonged to the Casablanca class, the most numerous carriers ever built. She displaced barely a third of a fleet carrier, with a shorter deck, thinner armor, and far fewer aircraft. What she possessed instead was urgency. She had been rushed forward to support the Iwo Jima landings, where Marines fought through black sand and concrete bunkers while her fighters flew dawn-to-dusk patrols over the beaches. Below deck, aviation fuel flowed through pipes that ran perilously close to electrical wiring, and bomb magazines sat behind bulkheads designed more for merchant service than prolonged battle. The Navy understood the danger and responded by wrapping the invasion fleet in overlapping layers of protection. Far out on the perimeter, radar picket destroyers formed a loose ring, their antennae sweeping empty skies for faint returns. Closer in, cruisers and battleships prepared heavier anti-aircraft fire, while directly overhead combat air patrol fighters orbited, waiting for vectors from plotting rooms crowded with grease pencils and half-empty coffee cups. It was a system forged through 2 years of brutal experience, and on most nights it worked. That night would push every assumption behind it. Bismarck Sea steamed at moderate speed with her escorts, blacked out except for shielded deck lights glowing dimly beneath canvas covers. Aircraft sat chained to the flight deck with wings folded tight while mechanics moved among them using flashlights taped to their wrists. Deep inside the ship, the Combat Information Center glowed with radar scopes sweeping pale arcs across glass as operators leaned close, headphones pressing into tired ears while land echoes from Iwo Jima's jagged outline flickered at the edge of their screens. Her captain refused to trust the calm. Since recent island campaigns in the Philippines and Central Pacific, suicide raids had turned routine patrols into nerve-shredding vigils, with some attackers diving out of clouds in daylight, and others slipping low across the water at dusk, invisible until tracer fire erupted. Night made everything worse. Wind carried the smell of burned powder from shore batteries while flares bloomed above the island and drifted downward like dying stars. On Bismarck Sea's bridge, officers scanned black horizons through binoculars that revealed almost nothing, while below them radio waves painted a different picture entirely. Shortly before midnight, a radar picket destroyer far to the north reported intermittent contacts, faint shapes skimming low and moving fast information that rippled ship to ship across encrypted circuits. Combat air patrol fighters launched immediately, engines roaring into darkness as deck crews scrambled under red lights, while controllers vectored them toward the returns with clipped, professional voices. The radar blips vanished, then reappeared farther south, evidence of Japanese pilots weaving through weather layers and changing altitude to probe for gaps in the defensive screen. It was textbook late-war technique. On Bismarck Sea, general quarters echoed through steel passageways as sailors abandoned bunks and mess decks, sprinting for gun tubs and damage control stations. Watertight doors slammed shut, fire mains were pressurized, and ammunition hoists clattered into motion while gun crews brought weapons alive across the deck. 20mm gunners checked feed trays, 40mm crews swung mounts skyward, and 5-inch directors warmed electronics that hummed faintly through the ship. No one spoke about numbers yet. They only knew something was coming. Fleet orders were blunt: protect the transports at all costs. Escort carriers like Bismarck Sea were not expendable in theory, but in practice they sat between attackers and the slow, crowded ships behind them, shields of steel, frighteningly thin. As midnight slid toward early morning, radar plots multiplied across the screens. Picket destroyers reported several groups approaching from different bearings, some fading away likely destroyed by fighters or swallowed by cloud, while others kept closing. One cluster dropped lower, skimming the waves so tightly that radar range collapsed, and gunners lost precious seconds of reaction time, the preferred approach for torpedo bombers racing beneath heavy gun arcs. Bismarck Sea altered course slightly to keep station while opening firing sectors for nearby destroyers, her escorts fanning outward into barely visible black shapes against a darker sea. On her flight deck, pilots stood by aircraft that might never get airborne in time. Their war was daylight. At night, survival belonged to radar operators, gun directors, and sailors gripping cold steel handwheels. Beyond the horizon, several Japanese air crews descended through cloud layers with throttles pulled back, scanning for silhouettes and luminous wakes. They had been briefed on the target, an escort carrier, smaller than fleet giants, still deadly, and still considered worth the cost. Back aboard Bismarck Sea, the first firm radar plot arrived from the screen bearing north-northwest, closing rapidly. Altitude uncertain data passed instantly to fighter controllers, cruiser batteries, and every gun director in range. The carrier's captain listened without comment, hands resting on the bridge rail, eyes fixed on black water as the warship around him surged, fully awake. Generators throbbed, motors whined, and hydraulic systems rotated turrets with slow, relentless precision while the layered defense network, forged over 2 years, slid back into place. Far out, destroyers prepared walls of tracer fire. Closer in, cruisers readied heavier shells. Overhead, fighters hunted invisible shapes in cloud-choked darkness. At the center of it all, USS Bismarck Sea steamed onward, her flight deck crowded with fuel and aircraft, and her thin skin separating several hundred men from the ocean below. In a few hours, history would remember her as the last American aircraft carrier lost in the Second World War. For the moment, she was simply one ship in darkness, listening to radar returns creep closer while the sky decided whether the system would hold. Somewhere north of the formation, engines droned steadily southward, and the night still had not chosen who would survive it. The first attacker burst through the cloud layer barely 300 feet above the water, invisible to human eyes until its exhaust flickered against the horizon. The aircraft remained invisible until its exhaust flickered against the horizon, a faint orange pulse that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Seconds later, radar operators aboard a nearby destroyer shouted fresh bearings into headsets as the blip sharpened on their scopes, fast, low, and closing on the carrier screen. Searchlights snapped on across the formation, pale spears cutting through darkness, and moments later gunners caught sight of a black shape racing over wavetops with wings barely clearing spray and its engine screaming at full power. The destroyer nearest Bismarck Sea opened fire first, tracers climbing in curved ladders that glittered before dropping back into the sea while the aircraft weaved between them, the pilot riding throttle and rudder with desperate precision. On Bismarck Sea, 40mm mounts swung hard to port as directors fed angles to crews gripping shoulder stocks and foot pedals, bursts stitching the sky ahead of the attacker in sharp white flashes. The Japanese plane refused to turn away and kept driving forward until a 5-inch shell burst directly in front of its nose. The aircraft vanished in a fireball, flaming wreckage cartwheeling into the sea and leaving behind only ripples and drifting sparks. There was no time to celebrate, because fresh contacts were already breaking low through cloud on the opposite side of the formation. More attackers followed behind them as the picket line folded inward and radar reports flooded circuits faster than plotters could update greaseboards. Fighters intercepted 2 raiders miles out, sending them spiraling down in pillars of flame that briefly lit cloud decks from within. Several aircraft still remained, approaching in scattered patterns rather than a single formation, slipping through different gaps in the defensive screen. One attacker dove steeply through tracer fire before leveling off just above the waves, while another crept in from astern, using the glow of burning wreckage as backlight to hide its silhouette. A third climbed sharply through flak bursts, banking away from a near hit before vanishing back into cloud. The system was being overwhelmed, and Bismarck Sea's captain ordered evasive maneuvers, turning into the wind to shrink the target profile, while destroyers surged outward to weave curtains of anti-aircraft fire, so dense they seemed to stitch the air into solid fabric. 20mm guns rattled continuously, their barrels glowing faintly as spent casings bounced across steel decks, while 40mm mounts thumped in disciplined bursts and 5-inch batteries launched star shells that bloomed overhead. For a moment, the sea looked like daylight, revealing 3 attackers at once racing toward the screen. One skimmed directly across Bismarck Sea's bow, low enough for gunners to glimpse the pilot's canopy flashing beneath starshell glare. Another dropped toward a nearby destroyer and released a torpedo before being torn apart by gunfire, the weapon streaking past harmlessly as the escort twisted away. The third aimed straight for the carrier, and every gun that could bear on it opened fire. The attacking aircraft shuddered under near misses as a wingtip sheared away and a spray of debris and flames burst from its engine cowling. Even so, it held course, descending toward the wide rectangle of the flight deck until a 40mm burst tore through the fuselage 200 yards out, scattering wreckage across the sea and throwing spray over Bismarck Sea's bow. There was no celebration. Another attacker was already breaking through smoke to starboard, higher this time, and dropping fast as gunners swung instinctively and streams of tracer fire converged on its nose. 5-inch guns fired directly overhead, the concussion rattling bridge windows as the diving aircraft vanished inside bursting shells and plunged into the water in a boiling plume. Several attackers had now been destroyed, but smoke, falling debris, and drifting starshell flares turned the sky into chaos while radar screens bloomed with false echoes from wreckage. Through that confusion, another plane slipped in from dead ahead, masked by smoke from a burning destroyer, unseen until it cleared the haze and was already inside a mile. Every mount on Bismarck Sea pivoted at once, turning the air into a lattice of tracers as the attacker climbed just enough to clear escorting ships and lined itself up with the carrier's centerline. Near bursts shredded fabric from its wings, 40mm shells ripped into the fuselage at 300 yards, and 20mm fire stitched across the cockpit until the aircraft disintegrated in midair and fragments tumbled past the bow. Seconds later, another aircraft burst through cloud directly behind it, steady and unwavering, dropping to deck height as the carrier's guns caught it late, and tracers chewed into wings and engine. The plane clipped the edge of the flight deck, cartwheeled across parked aircraft, and detonated among fuel lines and bomb racks, sending a wall of fire rolling across the deck while flaming gasoline poured into hangar openings, and aircraft ignited instantly. Shockwaves, buckled plating, slammed men flat at gun stations, and left one elevator twisted and burning as damage control teams sprinted forward before the echoes faded, ruptured fire mains spraying foam while sailors dragged wounded clear and hacked at wreckage with axes. Bismarck Sea never slowed, continuing evasive turns as escorts tightened around her. Another attacker dove from high altitude toward the towering smoke column, only to be torn apart by cruiser and destroyer, fire less than 1,000 yards away. 2 aircraft still remained, one destroyed by cruiser guns, while the final attacker plunged low toward the carrier through a gap opened by shifting escorts. Every remaining gun swung to meet it, tracers hammering the air as pieces flew from its wings and the aircraft skimmed wavetops through spray and shell splashes. A 40mm burst crippled the engine at 400 yards. Another caught the fuselage at 200, and the plane slammed into the sea in a towering geyser that drenched the carrier's hull. Silence followed, broken only by crackling fires and shouted damage reports. None of the attackers made it back, but the sky had taken its price. On Bismarck Sea, fires raged across the forward flight deck and poured into the hangar below as burning aircraft collapsed into twisted frames and ammunition cooked off in sharp, cracking bursts. Greasy black smoke clawed skyward while damage control teams pushed through heat that blistered paint and warped steel, spraying foam, flooding compartments, and rerouting power through darkened passageways lit only by emergency lamps. Casualty stations filled almost immediately with men burned by flame, choking on smoke, or pulled unconscious from compartments flooded with fumes, as the captain ordered counterflooding to correct a growing list to port, and pumps thundered through sealed spaces. Destroyers edged closer, ready to take off survivors if the fires broke free, while the battle turned inward from sky to steel. Crewmen hacked burning aircraft into pieces and shoved them overboard, others pushing unexploded bombs across the deck with long poles and tipping them into the sea before heat could detonate them. Smoke drifted low across the water, lit by wreckage and the distant glow of shore bombardment from Iwo Jima, until at last the flames began to shrink under blankets of foam and flooded compartments cooled glowing bulkheads. The momentary relief ended when aviation fuel vapors ignited beneath the burned section of deck, tearing open compartments under the hangar and rupturing pipes that fed fresh fires into already exhausted spaces. Ventilation ducts carried heat into neighboring rooms. Bulkheads glowed dull red. The list increased once more, and damage control officers reported that fire boundaries were failing. The captain confronted the calculation every carrier commander dreaded. If flames reached the forward magazines, the ship would not survive. He ordered preparations to abandon ship as destroyers closed to within yards, lowering boats and scrambling lines across black water. Men streamed toward muster stations carrying wounded on stretchers improvised from jackets and pipe rails, while others stayed behind to fight fires until ordered off, the crew moving without panic and with a discipline that saved hundreds of lives. When the final order came, sailors went over the side in steady lines, climbing nets and plunging into oil-slicked seas where escorts hauled them aboard. Behind them, USS Bismarck Sea burned through the night. Her forward deck collapsed, and smoke rising in towering columns visible for miles. At dawn, she was still afloat, but only barely, and hours later, after fires reignited and structural damage worsened, the remaining crew was removed, and the carrier slipped beneath the surface bow first. The last American aircraft carrier lost to enemy action in the Second World War. More than 300 sailors died in the attack and subsequent fires. None of the attackers returned. The ocean swallowed them all. What remained behind was a blackened patch of water and drifting wreckage, along with the sobering realization that even in 1945, wrapped in radar screens, heavy guns, and tight escort formations, a single thin-skinned carrier could still be overwhelmed in minutes by pilots who had no intention of returning. The invasion fleet pressed on, and with morning light, the ocean revealed what darkness and smoke had hidden. Oil slicks spread across calm water where USS Bismarck Sea had burned through the night, while twisted aircraft fragments drifted among life rafts and floating planks. Destroyers moved slowly through the debris field, hauling survivors aboard and towing overcrowded boats towards safer anchorage. Above them, the sky was empty, without radar contacts or engine noise. broken only by gulls circling overhead and the distant thud of naval guns still firing inland. For sailors brought aboard escorting ships, shock replaced adrenaline as some stared back toward the smoke plume where their carrier had vanished, and others slumped against bulkheads with hands blackened by soot and uniforms stiff with salt and oil. Corpsmen worked quietly among them, dressing burns, treating shrapnel wounds, and forcing water into men too exhausted to ask for it while casualty lists were drawn up, names checked, and checked again more than 300 from Bismarck Sea never answering roll call. Farther offshore, command ships filled with after-action reports as radar logs were copied, gun camera film collected, and destroyer captains dictated times, bearings, and ammunition counts. Every minute of the battle was rebuilt to understand how attackers had penetrated so many defensive layers. The conclusions were grim. Darkness had favored the attackers. Low-altitude runs had shortened reaction windows. Smoke from early shoot-downs had masked later approaches, and the fragile construction of escort carriers allowed a single hit to cascade into catastrophic fires. No one called the defense system a failure, but everyone recognized its limits. Bismarck Sea had not been the only ship damaged that night, and across the invasion area, destroyers and transports bore fresh scars from kamikaze strikes, some barely surviving, others limping away trailing smoke. The pattern would intensify in the weeks ahead, particularly off Okinawa, where radar picket destroyers became the fleet's most dangerous assignment, isolated miles from the main body to provide early warning while absorbing repeated attacks. The sinking of USS Bismarck Sea came early, in a brutal learning curve, and stood as a warning written in burning steel. For American planners, the loss reinforced changes already underway. More night fighters assigned to carrier screens, tighter radar coverage, recalibrated gun directors for low-altitude targets, refined procedures for fuel isolation and hangar flooding, and escort carriers pushed farther from the densest attack zones behind heavier ships. Those adjustments did not end the threat, but they reduced it. War at sea was never about perfect solutions, only margins. For Japanese commanders, the raid was logged differently. Another special attack wave launched, and another group of pilots who did not return, the arithmetic brutal on both sides. By February 1945, Japan's air arm was bleeding itself dry, as training pipelines failed to replace losses. Fuel shortages, restricted flight hours, and aging aircraft faced increasingly dominant American fighters. Suicide attacks could still sink ships, but they could no longer reverse the war. The invasion of Iwo Jima pressed forward as Marines fought inland yard by yard and airfields were carved from volcanic rock. From those new runways, American fighters and bombers soon ranged deeper into Japan's defensive perimeter, tightening the pressure that escort carriers like Bismarck Sea had been sent to support. Her destruction did not halt that machinery. It became part of its cost. Years later, naval historians would underline a stark fact. USS Bismarck Sea was the last American aircraft carrier sunk by enemy action in the Second World War. Not because the danger had vanished, but because the margin of American industrial output, air cover, and layered defense had grown so wide that such losses became increasingly rare. Her sinking marked the hinge between vulnerability and dominance. For the men who served aboard her, that abstraction meant little. They remembered heat and smoke, shouted orders through masks, and friends disappearing into flame-lit compartments. Some carried scars for life, others carried names. Decades later at reunions, survivors spoke less about the attackers and more about the quiet hours afterward when destroyers idled nearby, and the ocean felt impossibly calm for a place that had just swallowed a carrier. They spoke of damage control teams who stayed below longer than anyone thought safe, gunners who fired until barrels warped, and pilots who stood on burning decks waiting for orders that never came. The war moved on, and the sea closed, but the lesson endured. Escort carriers had never been designed to serve as shields, yet they became them anyway: thin steel, volatile fuel, and crews holding their ground because the ships behind them carried entire armies. Bismarck Sea had done exactly what she was built to do, remaining in the screen and keeping fighters airborne until the sky overwhelmed her, buying the invasion fleet another night. History often remembers battles decided by admirals and fleets, But sometimes it turns on a single thin-decked carrier holding station in darkness while attackers raced in from multiple bearings. When smoke cleared off Iwo Jima that morning, transports were still unloading men and equipment, hospital ships remained lit, and the shoreline continued flashing with artillery. The campaign went on. USS Bismarck Sea did not. What endured were patrol logs, casualty lists, after-action reports, and a quiet entry in naval records marking February 21, 1945, as the day an escort carrier slipped beneath Pacific water. A final carrier lost, a system tested, a night that proved how narrow the margin could be between protection and catastrophe even at the height of American naval power. The ocean kept the ship. History kept the meaning.